Welcome to this conversation with Mukul Kesavan. We've heard Mukul extraordinary oratory skills, and Mukul, again, great to be here and doing
Thank
this
you.
first
Thank you.
FT conversation with you, because I mean, like you saying about MT, MT was doing other things, and you are into, you write on cinema, you write on cricket, Men in White, and then you write on political affairs very regularly, right? So as a person who sort of, have all these, and you write novels, you write, and you teach history and all of that. So as a person who does all of this, I think, what's your, when you look at MT, what sort of, and you've had a career of, studied in Delhi, St. Stephen's College, then you went to Cambridge on a intellectual scholarship. So in all this journey, I mean, how do you sort of see MT? MT is, I think you get introduced to MT. So, as a person who also does a lot of these things, how do you, how do you feel about, MT's presence in the scheme of things?
Well, in the only way that someone of my background can feel, both a sense of enormous gratitude, a sense of profound embarrassment, because you realize that a full life dedicated to creativity and writing and filmmaking should actually result in an oeuvre of produced. So I think for all of us who engage with someone like M.T. Vasudevan Nair, the proper response is humility.
Right. Okay. So this conversation is called Literature, Cinema, and the Secular Common Sense. And this title is taken from your own 2001 monograph, Secular Common Sense, which I found extremely interesting. Let's just begin. What is the secular common sense? You wrote it a long time ago. So how do you, what were you trying to present, and how do you think about secular common sense today?
Okay. I just want to say that, since we are talking to, a large and varied audience, I just like to, instead of talking about the short book that I wrote, I'll just try and explain the general condition that prompted me to write it. This book was written in 2000, 2001, and it was essentially a response to the first majoritarian government that this country had seen, which was Vajpayee's government at the turn of the century. And a large part of my coming of age as a young man, I was born in 1957, and the formative political event in my life living in Delhi was the Delhi pogrom of 1984. In the wake of the assassination of Mrs. Gandhi, the terrible violence inflicted upon Sikhs through the political machinery of the party and the police. I was 27 years old. Many of my friends were the same age. As we participated in subsequent relief efforts, I think it was the first time in our young lives that we were brought face to face with the actual consequences of political intolerance. And I think that made a profound impact on us. So when Vajpayee's government came to power, it was something that was deeply concerning. Looking back, of course, it almost seems like a very dilute version of what we are going through now. But I wrote Secular Common Sense as a pamphlet, in the tradition of pamphlet writing. The impulse behind it was that if you had to explain to someone who was not sympathetic to, or did not know about your political position, how would you try and explain why a secular state was better than any other kind? And I think in the 25 years that have passed since then, 25 years that, in a sense, this book was out of date almost as soon as it was written, because it was published in 2001, and in 2002, of course, we had the killings in Godhra, which, in a sense, inaugurate a new chapter in the life of Indian politics. Over the last 25 years, I've come to understand that what the opposition that I made in this book between secularism and communalism is a fundamental misunderstanding of the Indian world. And this is something that is not original to me. Ashish Nandi, for example, a great social psychologist who has written extensively on this, has always argued that what in India is called secularism is not actually secularism in the classical European sense. The classical European sense would, of course, be the French definition of secularism, which is laïcité. Laïcité is a French word which basically indicates the rigorous distancing of the state from faith. That in the public life of the state, religion must play no role at all. And the French take it to an extreme, so that in France, if you hold a census, you do not in fact record figures dealing with religious affiliation. So France, at least formally, has no idea how many Muslims live in France, because the French government refuses to acknowledge that this is even relevant. It's a kind of extreme form of secularism. Now, India never had this. This was not what Gandhi's understanding of secularism was. This was not what Maulana Azad's understanding of secularism was. I'm not saying it was a better understanding. I'm just saying that the understanding was that the state must be equidistant from religion. That, in fact, even that the state must celebrate faith. You know, as someone who taught in universities my whole life, I was very grateful for this kind of pluralism, because it meant that every 2 weeks brought a religious holiday, which was very nice. I mean, you know, in Jamia, I used to tease my friends from Delhi University that we got more holidays for Hindu holidays than Delhi University actually did. So one of the great, marginal benefits of this pluralism was that we celebrated the religious highlights of every religious community in India. But more generally, I think the point I want to make now is that the real opposition, the real political opposition, the real battlefield, in a sense, is not between communalism and secularism, because that misunderstands what secularism meant to the anti-colonial leadership that brought this word into our vocabulary. The real conflict is between majoritarianism and pluralism. Let me just explain what I mean very quickly. That, if you read the histories written in the 60s and 70s by great historians like Bipin Chandra, for example, who had a very wide readership, Professor Chandra would often speak of Hindu communalism and Muslim communalism and Sikh communalism. And one can understand what he means. That is, when you begin to leverage religious solidarity in politics, you can call it a communalism of different kinds. If Hindus do it, it's a Hindu communalism. If Muslims do it, it's a Muslim communalism, so on. But that doesn't really explain the political reality of India. It doesn't help us understand the trajectory of Indian politics. The reason why the idea of Hindu communalism and Muslim communalism is misleading is because not just in India, but all over the world, the real threat to democracy, I'm not talking about pluralism here, the real threat to democracy is the mobilization of a nominal demographic majority. Let me just explain what I mean. So, in Burma, for example, the majority of people who live in Burma are Buddhists. There are, of course, Christian minorities, there are Muslim minorities. Similarly, in Sri Lanka, the majority of people who live there are Buddhists, along with, for example, a Tamil Hindu and a Muslim minority. The reason it's useful sometimes to take foreign examples is to understand that a demographic majority is not necessarily a political majority. It only becomes a political majority if it's deliberately mobilized in those terms. One of the great political thinkers of our time is a great scholar called Benedict Anderson. Benedict Anderson has written a book that all of us should read, and certainly all of us should try and teach. It's called Imagined Communities. And it is, in a sense, a comparative history of nationalism. And what Anderson says is that, look, nations are not given. It's not as if there's something that makes India a nation from ancient times to now. Now, we like to think there is because all nationalisms create a mythology for themselves. They create a kind of myth of origin. But really, nationalism is something that came up in the last 250 years. It's a modern phenomenon. And Anderson's argument is that nationalism emerges, at least in Europe, through the emergence of printing, through the emergence of mass literacy, so that when people write about issues, these writings circulate amongst a larger and larger number of people. And they begin to think that they share something. One of the most interesting things, and M.T. Vasudevan Nair would have been really interested in this, one of the most important things that Anderson says is that the two published forms that contribute the most to nationalism in Europe is the newspaper and the novel. Because when you read a classic 19th century novel, it just begins. It doesn't say what time it is in, what place it is in, it just begins because it assumes that the reader and the writer share the same time. And this notion of simultaneity is something that is new, that in a sense the printing revolution brings about. Similarly, when you all open the newspaper and read it, you are bound together in a kind of community of print. So the point I want to make here is that from the 1980s onwards, another kind of nationalism was being dreamt of and imagined. India is a country of contending nationalisms. It always has been. You know, we call, in India, the term nationalism is a good word because we associate it with anti-colonial nationalism. In large parts of the West, nationalism is a bad word because it's seen as exclusionary. It's seen as something that is directed at outsiders, at aliens, and therefore is a hostile form. But even if you look at the history of India, there were many nationalisms in India. You know, the Muslim League had a certain take on Muslim nationalism. The Indian National Congress created a plural nationalism. The Hindu Mahasabha thought or dreamt or imagined India as a Hindu Rashtra, as a Hindu nation. So I think the point I want to make about majoritarianism and pluralism as opposed to communalism and secularism is it helps us understand the way in which India is being changed. There are two contending dreams here. There is a pluralist dream that Gandhi and Nehru and Ambedkar and Azad dream. And there is a majoritarian dream, which is actually very much like European nationalism. You know, people like Savarkar basically look to Europe for their models. You know, they say the Germans have a German nation, the Italians have an Italian nation, that they have a common factor, which is language, reinforced by a common faith, which is Christianity. And this is the glue that creates the nationalism. So if you're going to learn your nationalism from the West, it's logical for you to do the same thing here. So, you know, many Hindutvadis are genuinely baffled by the fact that you think of them as inimical or bad, because they say, isn't this how nations are constituted? And they're right. Western nations are often constituted in this way. But we are not a Western nation. India, partitioned India, so happened, but India was born out of an imagination of the nation, principally driven by the Congress. And, you know, we can go into the reasons of why this happened, but they imagined a country. And Hindutvadis also imagine a country. Success or failure depends upon how you can persuade people of the desirability of your imagining. No nationalism is a given, and unless you fight for a pluralist nationalism, it will not endure, because it's not a house made of brick and mortar. It is a dream that binds us together.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's very interesting. I would want to just go into films now, because, like, you know, the way nation is imagined. So, you know, you take on, Bollywood, for example, or India's most powerful, entertainment industry. I mean, how do you see it playing out its role in the building of this nation, or also in the building of this pluralistic common sense, if you like?
Yeah. Let me say that, Bombay cinema, I really hate the term Bollywood because, it's not as if the cinema of Bombay was derived from Hollywood. It was often influenced by it, but the interesting thing about Hindi cinema as it emerged in Bombay, the first thing you have to think of is why is Hindi cinema located in a city which is 1,000 miles away from any Hindi speaking area? It's an extraordinary thing. I mean, why Bombay? Why not Lucknow? Why not Kanpur? Why not Banaras? Why not Bhopal, someplace within the Hindi Urdu speaking world? The second thing to remember is that till the end of the 20th century, the Hindi cinema, at least in its rhetorical power, was the Urdu cinema. It's really important for us to recognize this. You know, if you think of one of the great set pieces of Hindi cinema, which is the courtroom scene, you know, where lawyers would cross-examine witnesses, the language of that scene was always Urdu. So, you know, a person, an accused would be discharged as Baizzat Bari. An eyewitness would be a Chashmudid Gawah. The entire language of the court was, in a sense, heavily Persianized. If you think of its songs, you know, I always have a little experiment, which is the three operative words, the three rhetorical words that have great power in Hindi cinema is Dil, Khoon, or Kismat. Now, of course, you can translate them into Hindi. You can say Hriday, Rakt, and Bhagya. But they don't have the same rhetorical impact. You're not going to be able to sell tickets if you used a language like this. And the interesting thing about Hindi cinema is that it is invented in Bombay by the Parsis, because the precursor of Hindi cinema is the Parsi theatre. And when the Parsis found the Parsi theatre in Bombay, they're not interested in culture. They're interested in commerce, in profit. So they try and experiment with what kind of language can we do commercial plays in. They try English, it fails. They try Gujarati, it fails. Then they begin to try and use Urdu or Hindustani. And they realize they can't write it because they are Gujarati speaking. So this is after 1857. You know, this is after the mutiny. So they go to the great centers of Urdu writing in North India. They go to Bhopal, they go to Lucknow, and so on. And they literally, from the darbars of these places, they recruit writers of plays, of poetry, and invite them to Bombay to write their plays for them. And then they go touring with these plays because they also want an audience that they can profit from. So the point I want to make is all of this is inherited by cinema, especially by sound cinema. In the 1930s, when sound comes, all the personnel of the Parsi theatre, the actors, the musicians, the dialogue writers, all transfer to the Hindi movie industry. And really, so what you have in Bombay is this industry that is willing to embrace everybody for the sake of a profit. It doesn't matter whether you're Punjabi or South Indian or Bengali, whether you're Ashok Kumar or Rekha or Balraj Sahani. You're welcome so long as you help us sell tickets. The great contribution of Hindi cinema to a plural mass culture is precisely its complete indifference to culture. It has no interest in culture. It is interested in making a profit. Incidentally, they produce great songs, they produce some great films, they produce some great actors and directors. But this is not the aim. The aim, sitting in Bombay, 1,000 miles away from any Hindi-speaking area, is to create a lingua franca that can make money. And curiously, this completely Philistine commitment to commerce creates this great popular art form, you know, which produces Mother India, which produces Garam Hawa, which produces a succession of very great films along with lots of garbage, but which is open to everybody. I mean, I used to say to my friends that even in times of heightened communalism, the Hindi film industry was the industry in which people of every faith participated. I mean, the fact that the Khans are our greatest actors for the past 40 years tells us something about this industry. Things are, of course, changing now. There is no institution, there is no culture that can survive a completely dominant political elite. So things are changing. But I think what the Hindi film industry did was it showed us that you don't have to be a secularist. You don't have to be ideologically determined to create a pluralist state. By merely being open to the idea that everybody can participate in the business of producing something that can make money for all of us, that in itself is a benevolent position. I mean, it seems sort of crass and commercial, but that's what the Hindi film industry did. And in a sense, it was very fortunate that the writers of its dialogues, of its scripts, of its songs came out of this great efflorescence of Urdu writers in the middle of the century. You know, some of the greatest writers in Urdu, from Kaifi Azmi to Sahid Ludhianvi, wrote songs instead of poems for Hindi cinema. So the two things came together.
Right. So one question that I would have is, there is this idea of the common sense, let's say, and you're saying that it might buckle under the pressure now. So the interesting thing is the pressure from like various things. Like if you look at Hindi male protagonists, you know, there's a Dilip Kumar era, then there's an Amitabh Bachchan era, then there is a Shah Rukh Khan era. So in these periods, is there a way in which it's responding to or contributing to a kind of common sense of people in pluralistic ways, which you said the industry does in itself, because it's very curious. But, you know, or is it like, would you say it's just completely devoid of all these concerns? I mean, like, you know...
No, it's not devoid of these concerns. How could it be? I'm just saying its main thrust is not ideological pluralism. Its main thrust is profit, right? One of the interesting things about the names that you mentioned is that while great actors of every kind from all faiths participated in this, you know, from Sehgal, who came from Punjab, to Ashok Kumar, who came from Bengal, to Hema Malini and Rekha, who came from the south, to the great Khans who came in the late 1980s and the 1990s, from Dilip Kumar and Meena Kumari, and just a whole galaxy of stars who happen to be Muslim. The interesting thing, of course, is that while it is extraordinarily diverse and plural, you can see that all the male heroes, their characters, the way in which they present themselves, they're all upcaste Hindus. They're all called Raj. You know, in the sense that there is a kind of normalization within Hindi cinema of identity, that the default Indian is ideally a light-skinned, middle or upper class Savarna Hindu. So that, you know, that is one of the limitations of Hindi cinema. It's not, I mean, I was just thinking of how many films can you think of, how many sort of really successful films that can you think of where the star plays a character who is Muslim in some affirmative way. There are some. I mean, Amir Khan has played both good Muslims and bad Muslims. Amar Akbar Antony has characters who are specifically Muslim. Manmohan Desai, who made this film, the producer used to say that, you know, I always have to have a Muslim in my films because not till every poor Muslim in Bombay has seen my film 7 times will I make a profit. Again, it's not secularism. It's just the acknowledgement that your audience is diverse, that your films must appeal to that diversity. So I think, you know, there was this it's very interesting, this whole notion of playing a Muslim on screen. You know, there's that famous film, its name escapes me now, which is based upon the story of a young cricketer who is Muslim and who dreams of playing for the Indian team. I'm trying to think of what the name is. Not Udan. It's the story of this boy who's deaf, I think. Iqbal, that's right. When I saw Iqbal, I thought, my God, this is something new in Hindi cinema, because the fact that he was Muslim was not loaded. He just was Muslim. It was not that because he was Muslim, the story would take a certain direction. You know, when Shah Rukh Khan makes a film like My Name is Khan, the fact that he's playing a Muslim character means that the film, in a sense, is around that specific gravity of that character, the fact of his Muslimness. The wonderful thing about Iqbal was it was just a film about a young boy who wanted to be a great cricketer, who happened to be Muslim and who also happened to be deaf. And I watched that film and I thought this film is a miracle. Because for once, we can, as an audience, just embrace a character who happens to be Muslim without being concerned about his or her Muslimness. And that is very rare. You know, so despite the plurality and the diversity of Hindi cinema, there is a sense in which it deals with Muslim identity in often stereotypical ways.
Right. Yeah. Also, like other minorities and like
Yes.
North Indian entities and all that. So one question, like, coming to literature, in literature, for example, we had Raja Rao, R.K. Narayan, and R.K. Narayan and Mulk Rajan in the first phase. Then there was a phase of Rashdi, Amitabh Ghosh, all your sort of Arundhati Roy, all of that. And then, and these were all big figures, a lot of you, including you, a lot of you were writing at that time. And then came late 1990s and early 2000s, came this explosion of writing in English, Indian English. Bestsellers, Chetan Bhagat, Durjoy Dutt, all these people, right? Now, what is interesting is that there is a way in which elite, Anglophile people, who went to a certain set of schools, a certain kind of colleges, they looked down upon it and also left kind of had a problem because they thought this was majoritarian and it was simple, they thought, it was simplistic, one thought, populist, one thought. So there is, in literature, there's a lot more readers now in Indian English, right? But there is this idea that there is a shift towards majoritarianism in terms of the common sense of that popular best-selling novels, right? I mean, how do we engage with this? Do we say that there's a new class of people who are reading and we might have to write for them, but with a different kind of content? Or do we say that, we continue to write in the Rashdi, Ghosh, Roy sort of model, which is great writing, I mean, like in all of that. But at the same time, its political association is with a kind of, metropolitan kind of thing. This is more Mufissil, this is more middle class, a new middle class, a post-globalization middle class. How do we engage with this when we're thinking about the common sense of the Republic?
I think the first thing to say is that when Indians began to write in English, which is quite early actually. Bankim Chandra's first novel is not in Bangla. It is in fact in English. But as you point out, after independence, there are many generations of writers. You talk about R.K. Narayan and Mulk Raj Anand, and then of course there's Nayanthara Sehgal and Anita Desai and many others. Rushdie is something of a landmark because he achieves celebrity in the Western world to an extent that no other writer had managed, at least not after Tagore. The other reason he's a landmark is, of course, because of the controversies created about the satanic verses and so on. But also because there is a whole generation of writers who comes around that time. I'm thinking of Upmanyu Chatterjee, Amitav Ghosh, Vikram Seth, a little later Arundhati Roy, and several, and several other writers, who, in a sense, regardless of whether they are influenced by his style of writing or not, occupy the literary space that he has opened up amongst publishers and critics and magazines and academics, largely in the West, but because Indian institutions often follow Western leads, also in India. But one of the really problematic things about Indian writing in English, a great American novelist who reviewed Arundhati Roy's novel in the New Yorker, very prestigious literary magazine, said this is a wonderful novel. This is a great novel, but what is its audience? And when I first read that review, I felt annoyed because I said that, it's hard enough to write a novel without people constantly saying that in some sense your project is not legitimate because you're only appealing in a sense to a very small English literate elite in this country. Over time, I've come to realize that it's a reasonable question. I mean, it shouldn't stop people from writing fiction, Indians from writing fiction in English, but it is a reasonable question to ask who you're writing for, because unless you ask this question of yourself self-consciously, you won't be aware of your own unconscious biases in what you write and how you write it, unless you ask yourself, for whom are you writing it? So I think what happens in this newer generation, towards the end of the century and beyond, is that you have writers who are trying to address an English-knowing audience that might otherwise only read English how-to books or self-help books. One of the best-selling kinds of books in bookshops, as my bookshop friends tell me, are books in India that tell you how to improve yourself, how to succeed. Because India is a country of aspiration, and this is something that should not be surprising. So these people who would not normally read fiction are now being addressed by Chetan Bhagat and Amish. And Amish, for example, rewrites the Indian epics in different ways and packages them as novels. And I don't necessarily like or dislike any particular book of theirs. I'm not very enthusiastic about them. But I find the sort of snobbery about this kind of writing absurd, because unless you actually write novels that can be read by a larger number of people than you're addressing, and the literary novel very often is so self-consciously literary that it has a very high threshold of entry, you're never going to expand your readership. And I think this is what these writers have done. They have expanded our readership, and whether we can disagree with their political views and so on, but certainly as writers of fiction in English, they are now democratically, if you will, dealing with. We forget that Garcia Marquez was a best-selling novelist in his native country, as was Tagore, as was Tolstoy. So the great literary novelists of our time were bestsellers. They weren't confined to some precious, thin, upper-middle-class elite. Because of our colonial inheritance and because English was an elite language within India, we are in the peculiar position of, or Indians who write in English are in the peculiar position of addressing essentially a pan-Indian, allegedly cosmopolitan, but paper-thin population. And this population might expand, it may not, but nonetheless, the question of reception, the question of an audience, the question of who you're writing for, is a very important question, and one we should think about without the literary snobberies that prevent us from asking these questions.
Right. So, this is. I'll ask you a final question about. It would be interesting to students also. As a cricket writer, right? So, you write on cricket, and Ramchandra Guha calls you the best cricket writer we have in the country. So, which I agree with. So, the whole thing is when you write about cricket, are there questions about, like, you take certain political positions and you're a very strong advocate and all of that. So, as a writer, does it, do you think about cricket as, formulating the imagination of the nation, or, common sense, something like that? Or, is your commitment to the game, you're writing about, Virat Kohli, so I write about that. How does this, I just want to know.
You can't separate the two things. Ramchandra Guha is the best example of this. He has a wonderful book. I sometimes tease him by saying that it is your best book, despite his great books on Gandhi and the history of modern India. He has a truly classic book called In a Corner of a Foreign Field, which is a history of Indian cricket, which is a social history of Indian cricket. And when you read that book, the reason it's such a great book is that it shows you how the history of Indian cricket and the evolution of Indian cricket is shaped by the great social molds of religious community, of conflict, and of caste. So, for example, one of the greatest chapters in that book is the story of a great left-arm spinner in Bombay, a man called Balu, who was a Dalit. And he has these photographs where the rest, and you see, the only first-class cricket that was played in India Now, of course, we have the Ranji Trophy. But in those days, the only first-class cricket that was played was in Bombay in a tournament called the Pentangular. 5 teams. What were those 5 teams? There were the Europeans, so defined by race. There were the Hindus. There were the Mohammedans. There were the Parsis. And then there was the rest. The rest was anybody they couldn't fit into these first 4 categories. So you had these cricket tournaments where, and we can't romanticize this, where the audience was very often defined by religious solidarities. There were Muslims cheering on the Mohammedans, there were Hindus cheering on the Hindus. And Gandhi, who had no interest in cricket, which is the only black mark I can think about Gandhi, was appalled by this. He says, how can you have a form of cricketing competition defined by faith? How can we think about ourselves as a plural country when our cricket tournaments are divided in terms of faith? But the other thing about Ram's book is that he also shows you how caste determines this. How Balu, who's the greatest bowler of his time in India, can't have tea within the Hindu Gymkhana. Because he plays for the Hindus, but he's a Dalit. So he must have tea outside. So Ram, in his book, demonstrates perfectly how the history of a country also constitutes the history of its sport. And then he talks about the contribution that cricket makes to nationalism. The deranged kind of toxic nationalism that used to emerge in India and Pakistan when India and Pakistan played one-day cricket in Sharjah, for example, in the old days. So both Ram and I take great pleasure in watching cricket, as you pointed out. And when you watch cricket, I was just following, sadly, the match that India lost to England yesterday. I was in the aeroplane, so I couldn't actually listen to or follow the match when it ended. We lost by some 20 runs. In the moment, cricketing competition is all-encompassing. But cricket is something that is embedded in our world. So I remember a few years ago, a great Indian batsman, Wasim Jafar, who used to be an opening batsman for India, was the coach of the Uttarakhand cricket team. And he was accused of communalism or favoritism based on faith in selecting players. Completely unjustified accusation. And the extraordinary thing was that apart from 2 or 3 cricketers, Anil Kumble, to his great distinction, was one of them, apart from 1 or 2 cricketers, and Wasim Jafar had played cricket for Bombay, amongst the greatest names in Bombay cricket, Tendulkar and Rahane and all the rest. Nobody said a word in solidarity. So I think this is, I think the important thing is, one of the things that we need to understand is, whether we like it or not, our worlds are irradiated with politics. It's like you're sitting inside an X-ray machine and you're constantly being rendered transparent. Your innermost sinews are affected by politics, whether you like it or not. So when people tell me that they are apolitical, I can only imagine that they are indifferent to the way in which they are shaped by the politics around them. And I think one of the things that MT teaches us is that you can't just be a filmmaker or a writer or a novelist or an essayist. That even as a creative writer, even as a creative filmmaker, unless you account for the world, unless you make a reckoning with your world, it's not as if you can carve out a bubble in which you can be an artistic soul. Because that is delusion.
It's great. Thank you so much. That was a
Thank
lovely
you. Thank you very much.
set of ideas we got from here. Thank you so much, Mukul, for being with us today and for this conversation. Thank you, everyone, for coming.